Okay, good morning to everyone. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Hey, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel on Book Publishing 101. We're really looking forward to a good conversation today. Thank you especially to Vanessa Chavez at LASA for hosting us in partnership with the Association for University Presses. So we'll start off with introductions from our panelists and a roundtable discussion, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions and further discussion. So feel free to please post these questions in the chat as we go, and we'll make sure to bring them into the conversation and just leave plenty of time to talk about everything and address everything at the end of the discussion. Please make sure you're on mute. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So Kerry, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, my name's Kerry Webb. I'm the Senior Acquisitions Editor here at University of Texas Press. I work very broadly across fields of study within both Latinx, Chicanx, and Latin American studies. I've been at the press for almost exactly 9 years at this point. I was originally a PhD student in Latin American history at UT Austin, which is how I first came to Austin before switching over into publishing at a couple of other presses. And then eventually an opening came up here at Texas, and I was able to come back to Austin and work on all kinds of topics that I love.
My name is Kristen Buckles. I'm the editor-in-chief at the University of Arizona Press. And I, in addition to sort of overseeing the acquisitions department, I also acquire titles in Latin American studies, Latinx studies, Indigenous studies, and US-Mexico border studies. And I've been at the press in various roles for almost exactly 19 years.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angelica Lopez-Torres. I'm the International Rights Manager here at the University of Texas Press. I was a former associate editor, also acquiring in Latinx studies, and I've been here at the press for just about 9 years as well.
And if I think we're all done, I'll go ahead and kick things off. So we're each going to take turns talking about different aspects of publishing. And I was going to start with maybe the first steps. So for a lot of folks, those first steps are revising your manuscript, or in a lot of cases, a dissertation into a manuscript, and getting it ready to share with potential editors at presses. It's hard to really put a timetable on how long, it takes to write a manuscript. It really kind of depends on where you are in your career sometimes, and where the research has taken you, what kind of project you're working on. But I will say that it typically takes, sometimes a couple of years to have a fully formed manuscript. In a lot of cases, I'm talking to people who are still writing their dissertations. Maybe they're close to the end, kind of have an idea of where it's going, but aren't necessarily ready to submit anything quite yet. But I can at least initiate a conversation and learn more about their project, and hopefully be there for further conversations if it feels like a good fit for the press as they continue to develop and revise and get ready to turn it into a manuscript. One of the biggest things I would say in terms of, particularly with first books and changing them and revising them into a manuscript, is thinking about really overhauling the introduction. Obviously, it changes a bit depending on what field of study you're in. I came out of a history background, so one of the big things for historians typically is to try to cut out some of the unwieldy paragraphs on historiography that are expected by your dissertation committee. It doesn't always make for the most stimulating reading when it's a book manuscript, and a book is a very different entity from what a dissertation is. Your dissertation is for a very limited small number of readers, essentially your dissertation committee of 4 or 5 people who need to approve it, and where you need to show mastery of the area that you've worked on. But typically when you're thinking about a book manuscript, you kind of have to put on a different hat and look at it in a different way. This is a book that is going to be read by many people at many different stages of their career, of their own research. So you have a lot of freedom, is the way I tend to see it, a lot of ability to reimagine what a book could be, what the writing could be. You're not as hemmed in by the expectations of what the dissertation committee often needs to see in that manuscript. There's more room for creativity oftentimes in the style of writing. And that's something that I think as an editor, I certainly really look at when I'm looking at book proposals in a partial manuscript, or when people send me some sample chapters, is not just the content itself, but the accessibility of the writing, the style of the writing. Does that come through? Are there ways that I can, in minimal ways that I can coach you there, but is it there to some degree to begin with? So you really want to think about what that larger audience is going to look like, and how different it's going to be from the people who were on your committee, and what their expectations are. But it's also an opportunity, as I see it, to really expand the ways in which you imagine your dissertation. Often you had to leave research behind that couldn't fit in the dissertation, that you may want to redevelop into new chapters in a book manuscript. You may want to drop some big chunks. Sometimes people really change the dissertation into something completely different with the book manuscript, because they now have the ability, or they found new research that they really want to explore and share. Which is great. I really get excited to see the new things that people are able to bring out in a manuscript as opposed to the dissertation. But you do want to think, and this is, I'm going to follow up very quickly by talking about the proposal a bit. What applies to the proposal also to some degree applies to that introductory chapter of your manuscript. I often like to see sort of an opening anecdote. People will start with, perhaps it's a story that in some way ties in directly to the work, the research that they found. Sometimes it's a story about how they came to the research, but kind of a brief anecdote of maybe a page or two that tells me in that introduction. It kind of pulls me in as a reader, gets me excited, before then quickly going into the statement, the argument for your manuscript, what the book is essentially about. I will say probably more than anything that I see from readers when they read a manuscript or a proposal and sample chapters in a partial manuscript review is they say, like, this argument needs to be stated more clearly. It needs to be stated earlier. It can't be buried on page 10. It needs to be right there. It seems like such a simple thing, but it often gets lost, I think, in the proposal and the introduction, how important it is, and also how important it is to have your voice come through, your argument, what you want to say. Don't be timid about it. You really need to state it to guide the readers into the rest of the manuscript. And then from there, going into a bit of the conceptual background for the project, the kinds of research that you did, is something that's going to really engage the readers. And with a book proposal, it's both similar, but also very different in some ways. The book proposal is something that typically editors and sometimes outside readers will read if it's a partial manuscript review. And this is really typically, I would say, about 10 to 12 pages. It is something that's a quick synopsis for me as an editor who's often seen many, many proposals in any given week, to understand your project quickly, to get engaged by it, and also to understand some of the parameters of, so I can start to imagine what the book may actually look like. So some of the key things I'd say are essentially treating it, and each there are different ways of doing this, but I would say the most typical way is almost an annotated table of contents, where you open with perhaps that brief story about what got you into the research or the research itself, but then with that argument, very clear, very well stated, leaving no room for doubt about what is this book about, what is it contributing. But then from there, going into chapter descriptions of each chapter, we typically at our press say we'd like to see about a half-page single-spaced per chapter. And the reason I kind of talk about it at that length is because that can kind of tell me that you really have an idea, even if the manuscript isn't finished yet, you have an idea pretty clearly of what each chapter is going to sound like, what is going to be in each chapter. You can describe it in depth. Sometimes I'll see proposals where there are several chapter descriptions that are a half page, and then there's one chapter that's got maybe 3 or 4 lines. And I can clearly tell, okay, this person's still struggling with that chapter. They're still trying to figure out what it is. And that's okay, because we can still have a conversation about it. But be aware that editors really want to know that you've reached the point once we're seeing a proposal that you know where the manuscript is headed, even if it isn't completed yet. Some of the other key things I would say in a proposal are, it's going to, again, vary from press to press. So I would recommend that any press you're interested in, go to their website, see what guidelines they have for authors. We're all going to have slightly different ways of talking about what we need. So you may want to make slight tweaks to your proposal or cover letter, depending on which presses you're sending them to. So, for us, for example, we want to know your total word count, even if the manuscript isn't done, what you expect the total word count to be, including notes and bibliography. That's really key. And I also want to know what your number of images, and I want you to have a pretty firm idea of what those images are going to be. So, and also the difference between how many images in black and white, if there is color, how many are you proposing in color? And the part of the reason that's so key for us is I take those numbers, the word count numbers, the image numbers, and I'm able to calculate what it costs for the press to produce, like invest and produce the book itself, and how we can financially make this break even, at least. So I never want to find out later on that there's 40 more color images coming at the end of the process, that more than I expected, or that were stated in the proposal, for instance. And I certainly don't want an author either to feel like they weren't clear on what the expectations are, or what we've kind of agreed to in terms of image count. That's really key, as I think books have become more expensive to produce. I work on a lot of art history books and books with visual material in them. So that's something that I often have to hone in on, is really knowing, like, okay, I don't want to know approximately. I really want to know what you think, how many images you're going to have, because that way we can all be on the same page about what the expectations are. One of the hardest things I think for authors sometimes with the proposal is the marketing aspect of the proposal. But it's very key for us, I think, to, even from an early stage, to understand you're in these fields in ways that we as press members are to some degree, but not as intimately. So you're going to know which journals are important, what books have recently come out. It's fine to mention classic books that informed your work from 20 years ago, but what I really want to know is more about what books are on the verge of coming out, or are just now, like within the last 5 years, have come out that really inform your work or overlap with your work, and a little bit about, from your perspective, about how that work is different from yours, but also how it overlaps or informs your work too. It can give us almost like a little snapshot of what's happening in the field most recently, as well as with other presses, and can kind of give us a sense of, like, oh, well, there were 3 books on this exact same topic in the last year. This might be a little flooded right now, or maybe it's a sign that there's a lot of excitement in this field on this certain topic, and you have something new to contribute to it that we would be really interested in. But I think it's something that, as scholars or grad students, we're not really taught to do, to think about sort of soling our hands and imagining the book as an object that is being sold, that is being marketed, that is being shared, and making sure that it's being shared with the right audiences. We certainly have the background and expertise to know where, based on our own books, where different books should be marketed in terms of journals, in terms of ads, in terms of meetings, conferences. But I think it's still very important to hear from you, because you're immersed in a way and really have a touch on the most up and coming stuff that's starting to come out. And that really helps us get a grasp on how we can sort of envision the book and see it fitting into that dialogue, and also see it fitting within our press, or potentially not, but I might be able to then guide you towards a press that might be a better fit for that work. I realize like I'm kind of stretching over the time, so I want to leave plenty of time for Kristen and Angie. I think Kristen was going to talk next about the next steps of talking to presses.
Thank you, Kerry. For those who came in late, I'm Kristen Buckles, and I'm the editor-in-chief at the University of Arizona Press. So like Kerry said, I'm going to be spending the next 10 minutes or so talking about the next steps in the publishing process, really between proposal and contracting. And this largely entails like submitting your proposal to press editors, finding the right press, and the peer review process. So one of the questions we get asked frequently is it okay to send my book proposal to multiple publishers? And the answer to that is generally yes. You want to shop your proposal around, send it out to different publishers. And by publishers here, I mean university presses. I think we're all sort of speaking about university presses in this conversation. So yeah, send your proposal out to different university presses and see who might be interested. So how do you know which presses to contact? Guessing you probably already have a good sense for this, just from observing the books on your bookshelves and the publishers of those books, hearing your colleagues talk about their publishing experiences, visiting the exhibit halls at a conference. But if you're less sure about which university presses publish in your subject area, the Association of University Presses has a really handy grid of like all the university presses and all the subject areas that they publish in. That's on their website. And I can put a link to that subject area grid in the chat. Oh, thanks, Elizabeth did that. So you'll want to get a sense of like a handful of publishers that you're interested in working with and who you want to send your proposal to. And like Kerry mentioned, it's great to go visit their websites and find out what to include in the proposal, how to send it, and importantly, like what acquisitions editor is the most appropriate editor to send your proposal to. Email is the common way to send in a proposal, but please don't be alarmed if you don't hear back from an editor right away. Editors, we receive like a pretty high volume of email, lots of submissions. So it might take several days to get a response, especially if it's around when we're traveling, we go to conferences a lot. So be patient, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. If you have, you send your proposal out to several presses and you have, a few of them responding with interest and wanting to invite the manuscript for peer review, then you really need to figure out which press is the one you want to work with, because when it comes to the peer review process, university presses in general prefer not to compete with other publishers. And the reason really is because we invest significant resources into peer reviewing a project, time and money. And we really don't want to make this investment if there's a chance of the manuscript going elsewhere. So it's important to know that when it comes to peer review, you really need to know which press you're the most interested in working with. And one way to help you, if you have multiple presses who are interested, one way that could help you figure that out is setting up meetings with editors. A good time to do this is around conferences. If there's a conference coming up, shoot the editor an email and see if they might have time at the conference to meet. Or, if there's not a conference coming up, we do have meetings with authors throughout the year. Now, thanks to the pandemic, they're often by Zoom. So we do, another question I get is like, is there sort of certain time periods that you're talking with authors? And I think in general, we're doing that throughout the year. So set up a meeting and get to know the different editors who are interested in your work. The acquisitions editor is the person you're going to be working with for several months into years, possibly with one or more books. So you really want to have a good working relationship with this person. And it's your opportunity to ask specific questions about the press's publishing process, or questions about how publishing works in general. And the kinds of questions I get at my author meetings are things like, is it okay to include previously published articles in my book? How long does it take to publish a book? Will my book be in a series? What will the marketing department do to promote the book? Will I have any input on my book cover? Will I have any out-of-pocket expenses? And we can perhaps touch upon some of these in the Q&A if anyone's interested in these questions. So after you've met with an editor and decided on the one press that you would like to work with for peer review, then the next step is that peer review process. And peer review is the process that unites all university presses, no matter what university press you work with. Decisions to publish or not are largely based on that feedback we get through peer review. For a complete book manuscript, university presses generally commission 2 peer reviews, although it can really depend on the press and the kind of manuscript that they're working with. And it's important to know that editors do really put a lot of thought and care into selecting the peer reviewers to ask. This is such an important step. We really want to get the right people to review your manuscript. And in fact, editors will often ask the author if they have any suggestions for potential peer reviewers. We will often ask who we should not contact for peer reviewers. And so for the author, it's an opportunity to construct like a dream team list of people to read and evaluate your manuscript and to provide feedback. This list should be people, of course, who aren't too close to you professionally or personally. So for example, no dissertation advisors or no best friends. These folks who do end up peer reviewing, their identities will not be revealed to you. However, the reviewers will know who you are. So it is a single blind review. At the University of Arizona Press, we request a 6-week turnaround for peer reviews, and we do offer a small honorarium like all university presses. We also will provide the peer reviewer with a print copy of the book if and when it's published. And although many reviewers do deliver their reviews on time, it's quite common for a reviewer to ask for an extension if they know they're going to miss the deadline. So in terms of a timeline, I'm thrilled when I can get both peer reviews in within 2 or 3 months. But as an author, it's really important to budget ample time in your writing timeline for this peer review step, because editors commonly face delays in peer review, including difficulty finding peer reviewers for a project, a reviewer who is late delivering their report, a reviewer who does not deliver at all, requiring like the completely starting from scratch to find a replacement reviewer, and the notorious case of split reviews where one reviewer recommends publication and the other one does not. And in this case, depending on the project and the reviews, the editor may have to find a third reader. So because of these potential delays in peer review, do allow plenty of time for this peer review process as you're writing, especially if you're on a tenure clock. So when the peer reviews come in, the acquisitions editor will send you the reviews, and if they're positive, they'll ask you to write a response letter. And the response letter is a really important document that lets the press know how you'll revise your manuscript in light of what the reviewers are suggesting. And it should also provide a timeline for when you can deliver your final manuscript. And that timeline or that date that you deliver the final manuscript is really important for a press to start scheduling the publication date and the publication season for the book. So publication schedules can vary by press. Everyone kind of has a different way of doing it. For the University of Arizona Press, publication is about 10 to 14 months after we receive the final draft of the manuscript. So this approximately year-long process includes the time it takes to copy edit, to typeset, to design, to proofread, to create a marketing plan, to create an ebook, to print the print book, to get books to the warehouse, to get books to book reviewers. There's a lot that we do in that year to actually get a book out. So this year is also another important piece to factor into your tenure if you're up for tenure and promotion and you need an actual book. It's, add a year to that process just for the actual publication after you're done writing. So projects are accepted by a press by committee, and committee decisions are really based on those peer reviews, based on your response letter. Committees will read excerpts from the manuscript. And acceptance really means moving into the next phase of the process, which is contracting. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the University of Texas Press, Angelica Lopez-Torres.
Thank you, Kristen. Again, I'm Angelica Lopez-Torres. I'm the International Rights Contract Manager here at UT Press. And so I work on the other side of all the publishing deals with contracts and rights. Now that Kerry and Kristen have dived into proposals and finding presses, I thought for the purposes of today, it would be helpful to touch on some of the questions we usually get from our first-time authors regarding contracts, permissions, and rights. So usually when you've been talking to an editor, there's going to eventually be a conversation about the contract. And so at that stage, when you are ready to commit with a press, an editor will walk you through your agreement and the things to take into consideration before you sign a contract. And so a little like Kerry was mentioning, we'll want to know some things about the manuscript. We're going to basically cement it into the agreement, such as the word count, the image count. Are you going to be proposing color, the deadline to turn in your manuscript, and then of course if there are certain rights that you would like to keep for, say for example, like a certain language. So things of that nature will be part of the contract conversation. So as you may already know, with the contract, you are basically allowing us, the publisher, the right to print and publish your book, to distribute it, to sell it. Those are all considered those basic primary rights. Then there are other rights, which is what I work with mostly, that the author can grant the publisher that fall under the category of subsidiary rights. Those are subrights. So subrights, we usually get a lot of questions about because they're just something not everybody typically deals with. And so please, when you're talking to a publisher, please don't hesitate to ask for clarifications. We're always happy to help with those. We never want a contract to be intimidating. So really, like I said, authors are usually asking for specific questions about subrights. Here at UT Press, Kerry is pretty good about putting me in touch with authors so that I can walk them through some of the things that I can help with, some of the resources I can provide. And I'll say that before jumping into this specifically, that every press has different capabilities to be able to do this. So it's really great to have this conversation with your publisher because there'll be different ways that a press can help. But here at UT Press, what I am often doing is that I'm looking for several opportunities to license our books into various formats and languages. So that could be into audiobooks, for example, and then translations. What that looks like is usually that once a book has already gone into the stages of copy editing, into production, it's now designed and the publication date is a few months away. As soon as I have an available copy or a summary of the book that I can start sharing, I start marketing books into the international markets. So I have agents, we have agents here at UT Press that we work with all around the world. They are in various countries. I meet with them on several occasions. A lot of the times in the past few years, it's been through Zoom. I meet with them, I send them our books. I kind of have a good idea of what the markets are looking for. I send them our books and then they also pitch them to publishers there. I also travel when travel is possible to various book fairs to meet with publishers and then also with our agents. And I present our books, I pitch those books. So I'll, in a typical year, I'll go to the Frankfurt Book Fair. I'll go to the Guadalajara Book Fair. There's another book fair that's geared to university presses in Mexico City, Filuni. And then I'll also go to the London Book Fair. And then I'll do marketing campaigns that are around some of the other international book fairs. So at these fairs or when I'm having these meetings with international publishers, if there's interest in one of our books, I start to facilitate the conversation about licensing these rights to a publisher. I can coordinate an agreement if there's going to be a license for the translation. I'll make sure to implement a royalty structure, coordinate that the translation is going to happen in a timely manner and that it will be published and then it will be distributed. So this is, like I said, one of the resources that UT Press can offer, but again, different presses will have different structures. So please be sure to really talk to your press about the capabilities and how they can help you. And so more into how, when I'm talking to authors, there's oftentimes authors who are thinking, I'd like to keep my Spanish language rights. So before going ahead and putting that into the contract, I talk to our authors, I outline again these resources where I can represent their works and how I can try to secure a translation. It doesn't always happen, of course. It depends on the market. These past few years, it's been a little bit more difficult. And often when I do have this conversation with authors, it's pretty much a relief to authors that this is something that I can take off of their plate, that it's not an additional thing they have to be thinking about. So again, I'm really outlining that we already have good networks in these international markets. We've licensed books before to several of the publishers that they might already have in mind. But then I'm also happy to think about the networks the authors themselves already have and build on them. So sometimes an author will be like, I really want to work with so-and-so publisher. And that's what I'll try to kind of target first. But on the other hand, I've also had authors who've already translated works. They've either translated it themselves, speaking that language, or they have a friend who can translate. And they're very comfortable navigating and finding a publisher for their own translation in whatever desired country and in the desired language. And so that's also perfectly fine when we're having that conversation. We talk about if they want to retain those rights, we'll go ahead and say, for example, if they want to keep Spanish language rights, that's something we work into the agreement so that I know that I won't be pitching those rights and overlapping what they're doing. But like I said, often it's the authors who haven't navigated this realm before that are happy to help figure out where to send their work, and if a publisher is interested, then having that help navigating the license process, making sure that there's a publisher that we've worked with before that we know is reputable, will be able to get this out. So that's a very quick summary of sub-rights, but I do also want to jump into other things to take into consideration after a work has been put under contract. And I think both Kristen and Kerry kind of touched into this a little bit. It's about permissions for third-party materials in your work. So my department deals with that a little bit, and we field a lot of the questions that we get from authors through the acquisition side. So third-party materials can be anything that someone else holds copyright to that you will want to use in your book. Anything from photos, illustrations, lyrics, quotes from poems or other works. It could also be, as Kristen mentioned, previously published works of yours. This might be something you're going to have to clear with the publisher, the book publisher, or journal publisher. So if you're going to have to clear multiple third-party materials for your work, that's something you want to start thinking about pretty early on in the process. As soon as possible, really. I'd say don't start paying for any permissions, because of course you don't want to pay for something that maybe in the peer review process you'll take out, but you do want to have a good idea about what permissions you'll need and if they'll cost anything, because sometimes it can be kind of cost prohibitive if you don't really have a budget for these types of permissions. And so sometimes in the past, we've had authors who really are relying on fair use, which is a wonderful way to include this third-party material. And then they kind of get surprised that they're going to claim fair use on something, but the institution that's going to provide the high resolution digital file of the image is also going to charge for that digital file. So then they kind of get stumped with having to think about these fees and now having to find a budget. So those are things to start thinking about pretty early on when you're thinking about images, when you're thinking about quotes and things like that. Keep in mind too that there's going to be a different cost for any images you are thinking about for a cover. That's much later in the step of the process, but that's something to keep in mind, just because covers rarely are covered by fair use. So that's something that can be surprising for authors down the line. The other thing to keep in mind for permissions in the realm of subrights that I was talking about earlier is that sometimes third-party materials permissions, you want to make sure that those don't complicate a rights sale down the line, because if a permission doesn't cover, say, world rights in all languages, then it's hard for another publisher in a different country to be able to commit to a translation. Same with a heavily illustrated book, something that has a lot of color throughout. It's just more cost prohibitive for another publisher to take that on. So those are things to consider if you have aspirations for a translation. You really want to see something in Spanish, you want to see it in an audiobook. That might be something to have a conversation with. So really, as you're putting these things together, as you're thinking about these things, have a conversation with us as early as you're having an idea about it, and we'll be happy to try to figure that out with you, give you a better sense of what you need to start preparing for. And I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was a great presentation. And now it looks like we've got about 20 minutes for questions, and we already have wonderful questions in the chat. So I'm just going to jump in. There are a couple about translation, so I think that would be a good place to start. We have some questions about publishing, whether university presses here will publish books already translated in Spanish, for instance. Will you translate those books into English yourselves? And does this affect the process?
Do you want me to take that one, Kerry?
Sure, sure. I can add on if there's anything.
Yeah, we have in the past published works that have been originally from Spanish. It's a little bit more a difficult process, just because we have to pay for the underlying rights to be able to publish it in English, and then you have to pay for the translation itself. So yeah, it's just a different process, but it has been done in the past.
Yeah, and as far as looking at proposals, sometimes authors will say, this was originally published in Spanish, but I published it with a Spanish publisher. in Latin America. I'm currently either translating it myself or had some help with a translation. It's still a little tricky for us to take on sometimes, because then we have to do a peer review where we need a peer reviewer who is fluent in both languages, because we want to vet not just the contents of the book itself, but the translation as well, to see how accurate it is. And finding readers who are specialized enough, or that we feel confident enough can read in both languages and sort of speak to both of those aspects of a review, can be tricky and a little difficult. So it really depends sometimes for me on the topic itself, the potential for the audience in English. And considering that, you know, for a lot of my readers, they are fluent in Spanish, so they may have already had access to the Spanish book. So we have to think about some of those gnarly bits of like, how many books can we sell in English realistically too, all factor into that acceptance or not.
I echo everything you both said. I believe at the University of Arizona Press, we have published books that originally were published in Spanish. Usually the author will take on obtaining rights and translating the work. Like, we don't have a big budget or a budget at all to hire translators or license those rights. So it's really the authors will do that work. And just to echo Kerry, it's a more complicated process for peer reviewing this kind of content for all the reasons already stated.
And to follow up on that, what about who's responsible for initiating the process of translating into Spanish, or obtaining a Spanish translation, or an audiobook translation or an audiobook edition of the book? Is that up to the author or the press? Who initiates that?
That's going to vary from press to press. You know, here at UT Press, as soon as a catalog is available, I'm starting to pitch all of our works that I have rights for. So I'm initiating that. I'm getting it into the hands of different publishers. And usually I'm reaching out to our authors individually to tell them that I'm doing this, in case there's anything something else that I might not be considering. Or saying, you know, sometimes our authors, when I write to them that I'm like, this is the work I'm doing, they'll tell me, wait a minute, I've already published with so-and-so. And hopefully I would have already known that if I did my research correctly. And they say, like, please contact so-and-so. So there's things like that sometimes, you know, I build on. So, but other presses, you know, you might want to just talk to your editor and just talk to them like, hey, this is something that I'm interested in. Is there resources that I can tap into and have that conversation?
Yeah, and as I'll sort of speak about smaller presses, because the University of Arizona Press is smaller than Texas. We have sort of a half-time rights person, a person who is like half their job is managing rights, and she doesn't have capacity to do more proactive work licensing rights. And so generally it's other publishers coming to us asking about work. So it's really the author or other publishers who are interested in translations. And same with audiobooks too. We currently aren't creating our own audiobooks. We have vendors who come to us interested in our books and getting those rights. And so those sort of come to us instead of sort of the flip, which is sort of proactively looking for audiobook publishers. I don't know how it is at Texas for audiobooks.
It's the same process where I'm including our audiobook publishers that I'm pitching, because the production of an audiobook is a much different thing than a book production. So it's very rare that at a university, there are a few of the bigger ones that produce their own in-house audiobooks, but mostly we're licensing them. And so I'm pitching those along with anything else to other markets for translations as well.
We have a couple of questions about the proposal stage, so I'm going to kind of collect those together. One question about whether if there's a book subvention or subsidy available, is that a good thing to mention at the proposal stage? A question about whether if the proposal is reviewed, is a contract offered at that stage? And a question about the timeline. When should authors be submitting a proposal? How far out from publication do presses typically receive proposals? And what would you recommend?
I'll say to the first question, yes, absolutely yes. If you have subvention or even the possibility of subvention, please mention that in your proposal. It is so helpful to us, and not that we're going to turn down a project because it doesn't have subvention, but it is helpful to know. And you know, alongside the word count and the image counts that I use to calculate those production costs I talked about, I can also add in that information if you have either know the amount of subvention you have, or if you haven't applied yet, but your university has a certain amount that you think you can get. It is maybe not secured yet, but you have a ballpark idea. You can certainly add that in, and I can factor that into those costs for the books, and that can help me get a sense. So oftentimes, if an author says I have color images, I really need an insert in the middle to include these color images, then we do increasingly need to see some sort of subvention outside of the press that can help cover it, because otherwise it's pretty difficult. And knowing also that those books hopefully will eventually sell through their print run, we want to keep it alive and available to people. It's going to turn into print on demand, and print on demand technology is not great with color images, so those images will turn to black and white somewhere further down the road. So you really want to think about those aspects of what do you really need, what is essential, how is it discussed in the book to support the inclusion of color. Obviously, with a lot of art history, there's often color is needed either in an insert or throughout. Throughout is more expensive. So we often have to think creatively about how we can help support a book that includes those materials.
I'll just echo that note on subvention. We also at Arizona, really, if you know you have a subvention, it's great to put that information in the proposal, as Kerry said. And to echo it, we're not going to decide that editorial decisions do not happen based on whether or not you have a subvention. It's just really good to know upfront, so we can sort of factor that into the budget for the book. And I mean, the big picture reality is that in general, you know, a lot of books, the sales don't cover all of the costs that it takes to produce a book. So the revenue from books don't cover the costs of publishing a book. And that's been documented in lots of places, so that's not a surprise. There are about 120 something university presses who are publishing the work of scholars from thousands of universities. And so a subvention is an opportunity for the universities that don't have university presses to pitch in to the landscape of scholarly publishing and participate and help their faculty with their books, because you know, these 120 or so university presses are doing all the work to support all of the faculty out there. So everyone can participate through a subvention if that's available. Go ahead, Kerry.
Oh, I was just going to ask Elizabeth, could you repeat the other two questions that were tied in there?
Yeah, so one question was about when a contract for a proposal would be made. Does the editor offer a contract when they see an interesting proposal, or do you wait until after the peer review process? So there are a couple of different routes to review and contracts. One is people have a full manuscript that's ready that they share along with the proposal when I look at it.
and that full manuscript is going out for review. Sometimes there's also the option with presses of doing a partial manuscript review. So based on that, typically editors want to send the proposal, a very thorough proposal, I should say, as well as two well-revised chapters that go out. So maybe you're still working on the rest of the manuscript, and there are all kinds of reasons people may want to do a partial manuscript review. Maybe they're on the job market, having an advanced contract would help them once that partial manuscript is reviewed. And if we feel like those reports are strong enough, we can offer a contract at that point. Sometimes it's people who already have a job and have tenure, but can apply for a sabbatical if the book is under advanced contract, and that will give them more time to complete the full manuscript. So there are different ways to it. I would say that it's pretty rare that we would put a book under contract without any kind of review. We really rely on reviewers to, offer their input on, there's almost always going to be some suggestions for revisions and things that they're specialists in the fields in ways that we're not quite as much. So we really rely on those to help us vet whether this is in strong enough shape to feel like we can offer a contract.
Yeah, it's the same for Arizona. We will send proposal through peer review and offer a conditional contract or an advanced contract. We call it a conditional contract because really the condition of that contract is that you're gonna, like, when the full manuscript is done, that's gonna go through peer review. And so that is sort of ultimately, I think every press is gonna peer review that complete draft of the manuscript. So when we talk about conditional contracts or advanced contracts, it's a sort of a two-phase vetting process. So at least 2 rounds of peer review. Always going to have peer review for that final acceptance is always going to be based on how that final manuscript reviews.
So regarding the timeline, a question about, is it okay to pitch the project to an editor before submitting a proposal? And also, do you have any guidance to offer about when prospective authors might submit a proposal, how far in advance of publication they should submit?
I guess I'll start by saying, yeah, I have conversations with people about projects often well before they're ready to be reviewed. Sometimes it's just they're just getting into they're still doing the research. They haven't even finished the writing or even really started the writing, but I can have a conversation there. I mean, there's not much I can commit to until I see a proposal and a partial manuscript at least, but I'm always interested in having conversations with people and hearing about their work, even if it's still you're still kind of figuring things out. It may be something that I feel like is a good fit for the press that I'm excited about, and I want to continue to have that conversation as you get closer to having a proposal ready. But as Kristen pointed out about the timeline, it's often hard to gauge how long it will take a book to come out, not just with the review process and the length of time that takes, but obviously getting it through copy editing and production, but also, life happens to people, things delay people unexpectedly, that can make a book take a little more time than they had planned on. So it really, for me, when the rubber hits the road is when I see that proposal and some sample chapters. And everything from there on, I'm trying to communicate as clearly as I can with the author about where the timelines are. And you should always feel free. I mean, this kind of undergirds everything we're talking about here, but feel free to, really ask the questions that are on your mind. Never feel like you should know the answer to this already. This is a mysterious process, I think, to go through. We're not really trained to think about this in grad school. It just feels like such an abstract idea for most of us that this is something we know we'll eventually have to do, but you're sort of have so much on your plate in front of you that you kind of have to put it to the side. So you really should feel like comfortable with your editor or editors that you're talking to ask these questions. And if you don't, that might be a sign that perhaps this is an editor that isn't quite for you, but it's not on you to know the answers to all of this. You should always feel like you can ask us these in further conversations.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Let's see, we have a couple more questions. Are you seeing delays in peer review because of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think during the pandemic, like at the sort of the height of it, 2020, 2021, we had a lot of people just sort of like drop out, sort of fail on it. And like they just sort of, and it was just life, you know, and but I feel like maybe we're kind of coming out of that a little bit. So I don't know. I think it's still yet to be seen.
A question about agents. Do you accept projects that come through agents?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare with scholarly books that there's an agent attached, but sometimes there is. But yeah, certainly I'm always happy to talk to agents or have agents reach out. And I mean, I don't know if Kristen, what your experience has been, but I think that it's you know, obviously there are a few extra steps in the process sometimes with an agent in terms of negotiating if it gets to a contract stage of negotiating the contract, but it's not unusual.
We work with agents, but usually they come with the creative works and less with the scholarly works. And Angelica, do you have?
That's all I was going to add about it. And, you know, for the scholarly works, it's just more rare just because there isn't, you know, with an agent, there's going to be an advance discussion that will happen. And we're just going to have fewer budget opportunities for advances.
So it looks like we may be at time here. I don't want to call it too early. I am going to post one resource in the chat. AU Presses, the Association of University Presses, maintains a site called Ask Up, which is like an FAQ database, which covers a lot of these topics from the proposal through marketing, contracting. So I know we didn't quite get to everyone's questions in the chat. Vanessa, I don't know if you want us to wrap up here and maybe.
You can keep going. If there's a couple more questions, we can extend up to 10 more or 15 minutes. It's up to you.
Okay, if that works for the panelists. A question about editing for non-native English speakers. Do non-native speakers get additional support in the editing stage?
We have copy editors at the University of Arizona Press that we work with who are really comfortable copy editing manuscripts, both in English and in Spanish, for example, and working with scholars where English might not be their first language. So that's something our editing, design, and production team is really great about, is when there is just really thinking carefully about the right kind of copy editor for the particular manuscript.
Yeah, same here. And you know, I'll say too, like sometimes in readers' reports, we'll see comments from the readers on, oh, there's a lot of grammar mistakes, there's a lot of language issues here. And sometimes I think as an editor, you know, we we know that this isn't necessarily a ding against you, that there are these aspects of writing in a different language that are factoring in there. So we can certainly have that background knowledge there to kind of keep that in perspective, and also be aware of making sure we find the right copy editor who can really help with those aspects of language too.
How does the indexing process work for books? Yeah, this person is interested in having their book indexed in Scopus because it's the minimum requirement, which steps should be followed.
I'm not familiar with Scopus, I'll be honest, but I can just say typically the author is in charge of indexing their own book. Sometimes there are authors who have some subvention money that they can set aside for indexing later on. And indexing doesn't happen until it's well into copy editing and we know where certain terms or words are going to land on which pages, because obviously that changes from a manuscript once it's copy edited. But that is typically on the author. And oftentimes it's helpful to have the author do it because you know the terminology that is really crucial to readers in a way that maybe an indexer won't quite as much. But we can certainly offer the names of indexers that you can reach out to if you're thinking about having someone do it ahead of time. So you can plan ahead, budget a certain amount of money for when that time comes, and also see if their schedules are open to fit in with the copy editing schedule. Oh, there was a quick question about usual cost for indexing. I think it's typically $4 to $6 per page right now is my understanding. And obviously it depends on how tricky the book is, how experienced the indexer is. It might go a little higher.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's the same for the University of Arizona Press. And I think university presses in general, it's really one of the author's expenses is to cover the index, whether they do it themselves or they hire someone. And we often hear that $4 to $6 or $3 to $6 per book page. So it's not the manuscript page, it's the book page. So it's going to be a little bit shorter in most cases than the actual manuscript length.
Okay, so it looks like for our final question, how do universities presses like it or not publishing under open access options?
You want to go, Kristen?
Yeah, no, so at the University of Arizona Press, we're a part of the library and the University of Arizona Libraries, and the libraries are very interested in open access. And so we've sort of grown in a direction where we value open access when we can. That said, it's we're still kind of working out how to make it work from a financial perspective. And there's certain experiments that we've tried and programs that we've participated in with open access. And so for us, we are really starting to get into open access publishing. It does take a subvention to make the finances work. And the amount is sort of we're still trying to sort of figure out what that amount is.
Yeah, I mean, same here. I think for Texas, we're still very much in the figuring out which is the best path forward, both for the press and for authors in terms of making this work. Just to add to what Kristen's saying, I think also if you are in a situation where your material needs to be, so for instance, I have several authors who have NEH grants and previously had, as part of their NEH grants, had funding to help with open access, but it wasn't mandatory. More recently, that has become mandatory for certain NEH grants. So that's might be something to flag or add into the proposal so that we're aware of it and can discuss that as part of whether it's either funding to help with open access, but not mandatory, or if it is mandatory, this is helpful. I recently had an edited volume where the volume itself is not open access, but there was one author who has, as part of his funding, had to make his chapter available as open access. So in that case, what we decided to do was just allow that author to make it open access through his own institution's repository, but the rest of the book is not available as open access. But again, it would have been helpful to have known that maybe at the earlier stages of things, just so we could sort of plan ahead for this. But, you know, things are changing quite a bit. So it was helpful to have that experience and think through what do we do in these situations with edited volumes as well.
Well, thank you so much to our three presenters today, Angie, Kristen, and Kerry. We're so grateful. To Vanessa and Lhasa, again, thank you. This has been recorded and will be on the Lhasa YouTube channel, it looks like. So lots to come back to, and thank you all so much for being here and for your time, and good luck with your projects.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.